It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. And we have a very interesting study planned out for today. I'll admit something to you guys. I was very humbled this week as I studied this lesson for a few different reasons. Daniel chapter 11 has been one of the most challenging chapters to study prophetically and historically for a number of reasons. And in my personal opinion, it's among the two most difficult chapters to be understood in the whole Bible. So we have Daniel 11 in the Old Testament, and then we have Revelation chapter 17 in the New Testament that are quite challenging for a few reasons. But as I studied this week, there was one thing that resonated again and again and again in my mind as I studied this, is that overall, after all the details, after all the kings and the battles and the controversies and the political plots and all of that, there's one thing that we can be certain of. God is always in control. God is always in control. If there's one thing that emerges by the study of this chapter, is that God is always in control. Now, when it comes to chapter 11, it becomes very easy to lose the forest for the trees, if you understand what I'm saying. Because there's just so many details and there's just so much history packed into 45 verses that if we take too long on 1 or 2 or even 10 verses, we're going to lose our whole study. So today, don't be disappointed if we jump over major sections of history, because there's two options. Either we spend an hour talking about 2 verses, or we spend the 40 minutes that we have talking about 45, and that's what we're going to do. So don't be disappointed if we jump over a few sections of history here, because many of these sections, they are easily traceable, and you can easily study them in history books for yourself. All you have to do is open up scripture, open up history, and you'll see that that it becomes fairly easy for you to, at least up to verse 39, you can easily accompany history through the Bible, and so you can do that yourself. But from the get-go, I want to make 2 things very clear. First of all, Daniel's vision in chapter 11, it's part of a bigger section. When it comes to the last vision of the book of Daniel, you can't isolate chapter 11, because chapter 11 is the middle, it's the body of the vision that begins in chapter 10 and that ends in chapter 12. So chapter 10 is the introduction or the prologue. Chapter 11 is the body of this vision, and then chapter 12 is the epilogue or the conclusion of the vision. So keep that in mind. We already began this study last week with chapter 10. Today we're going to get the full body, the content of the vision, and then in chapter 12 you'll have the conclusion with Michael standing up. And so that's going to be a very exciting study also. The second thing that we can make that becomes very clear is that chapter 11 is parallel to other major visions. So this is very important. When you understand that chapter 11, it's not isolated. The historical content, the details, they're not isolated inside of that vision itself. But you find major parallels inside of the other prophetic visions and the other prophetic chapters of Daniel. So you'll find a lot of parallel within verse 2 with Daniel 8:20, with Daniel 8:21. So Daniel 8 and Daniel 9 have many parallels with chapter 11. So when you understand that, it becomes a lot easier to interpret chapter 11. Because if I can get the details from that chapter and compare it with the previous chapters that cover the same period of time, although through different perspectives, it becomes easier to identify what's going on. Does that make sense? So you get the previous visions, you see what they're talking about, you go to chapter 11, that's a bit more complicated and confusing, you compare that to the previous chapters, then you can have a clear understanding of what's happening, of what's going on. Also, and here's a really interesting thing, each prophetic chapter, their outline reaches its culmination in the fact that God, the Most High, Yahweh, He is in control of history. He is in control, as we already stated. So for example, in chapter 2, what happens? How does God emerge? He is the rock that smashes the feet of history, right? In chapter 7, he is the Son of Man that receives the kingdom. In chapter 8 and 9, he is the one that cleanses the sanctuary. So if there's one thing that emerges as a pattern in Daniel, is that God is in control. Is that the climax, the closing of history is done by none other than God. No one else has that power. No one else has that authority. God is always in control. Now, while the lesson does give us a good breakdown of these sections, another thing to understand here from the beginning is that the whole chapter, chapter 11, can be divided in two major arcs, two major divisions of history. So you get from chapter 11, verse 1 through 22, that is the first arc, the first division of the chapter, and then from verse 23 through 45 is the second. Now, of course, inside of these major divisions, these major sections, these arcs, there are subdivisions. But basically, you could divide the chapter in these two parts. And the reason for that is because from 1 to 22, everything that happens BC, before the Prince of the Covenant appears. And then from 23 all the way through 45, that is after the Prince of the Covenant. So in the same way in which the Bible is divided between Old Testament and New Testament, this chapter can be divided between what happens before Jesus and what happens after Jesus. So let's keep that in mind. So we won't be able to cover everything. It'll be enough for us to have a main outline of what is going on. The chapter begins describing the transition from the Medo-Persian Empire to the Greek Empire. Okay, that's what we find here. And this is the reason for verses 1 and 2, for us to see the transition that goes from Medo-Persia. And we find this already. In chapter 2, we found that the succession of kingdoms goes from Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece to Rome. In chapter 7, you find the same kind of outline with the animals, the 4 animals that emerge. In chapter 8, you find that with the ram with 2 horns and the goat. So this is a parallel here. And in verse 1 through 4, we find this outline where Daniel, he receives this vision of Medo-Persia transitioning into Greece. Verse 1 and verse 2, they give us some information. We're not going to read them, but we find some information here about these kings that emerge. It mentions 3 kings and then a 4th one that is very rich. Now, the first text, I'm going to read it for us. It'll become easier. It says here in verse 2, "And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. But not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these." So here we have a reference to these 3 kings, 3 mysterious kings that emerge in the chapter, then a 4th very rich king. And the sequence that we find in history is exactly this. This vision is given to Daniel, beginning in Daniel chapter 10. You'll find that the king that is in command is who? Cyrus. He is the king in charge. But the succession of history gives us 3 kings, Cambyses, the false Smyrtus, and then Darius the First. These 3 kings, it's really interesting when you study their life. Cambyses, he arises. He has a lot of stuff going on. He kills his brother Smerdis. He then goes on to campaign in Egypt. While he's there, this false king, the false Smerdis, he arises, and then Cambyses takes notice of this. He hears about this, and he's on his way back to the capital to take care of this problem. And on this way back, he dies. Now, many say that he committed suicide. Others say that it was an accident. But what we do know is that Cambyses dies. And then this false Smerdis, he also doesn't last that long on the throne. King Darius, who wasn't a direct line to the throne, he takes up power through his military conquests. And so that's basically what happens in this time period. The following king that appears in verse 2 is none other than Xerxes. And Xerxes, he is the same king that we find in the book of Esther. That's the same Xerxes. He is a very wealthy king. And he is mentioned here because he is the king that battles, that takes war into Greece. He is one of the only 2 kings in Medo-Persian history that fights or that invades Greece. Now the Greeks, they can't do anything immediately. They cannot retaliate immediately. They are not strong enough. So over a century later, over a century later, they do invade Medo-Persia, and that happens under Alexander the Great King, Alexander Magnum, as many call him. And all of this happens under him. He invades the Medo-Persian Empire, and we find here in these few verses, in these 2 or 3 verses, we find that Alexander the Great, he conquers the known world in a very short period of time. And again, this draws a parallel to the other chapters where we find the leopard with 4 wings. Remember that? The leopard with 4 wings in chapter 7, and then in chapter 8, we have the goat that runs so fast that he doesn't even touch the ground. And that represents Alexander the Great, the first great Greek king that conquers the known world in a very short period of time. But at the height of his power, when he's 32 years old, he also falls, he dies, and his kingdom is then divided among his 4 generals. What's interesting is that Alexander, he did have a young son, but his young son, as the prophecy foretold, this young boy, he doesn't inherit any of his father's lands or power or any of that, and the land is then divided. The empire is divided among the 4 kings. So, the 4 generals. So, what we find here is that the general Seleucus, he is in command of Syria and Mesopotamia. This is the great lighter green portion right here. We have Ptolemy down in the south with Egypt. We have Lysimachus in Thrace and parts of Asia Minor right there up there in the northwest. And then in the west over there, we have the last of his generals, which was Cassander with Macedonia and with Greece. So that's the main map that we have. Now, from verses 5 through 15, and if it seems that I'm rushing, I am, because I want to get to a certain part of history here. This we already mostly studied. If you accompanied chapter 7, chapter 8, then you already know about this. But from verse 5 through 15 of Daniel 11, what we find is an outline of the battles of 2 of these dynasties, the 2 prominent ones, the 2 most important ones. We find the battles of the northern king and the southern king. Now, these 2 generals, Seleucus and Ptolemy, they were the ones who amassed most power, most dominion. They were the ones that, if you take a look, and this is why this is so important. So, if you take a look at the map, you'll find that the king of the north in this area and the king of the south in this area, what do they have between them? They have Judea. So that's why we have so much information about the king of the north and the king of the south. First, because they were the 2 generals that emerged as the most powerful. But second of all, it's because they were the ones who were in a position to oppress the children of God. Now, one of the main questions that arises that a lot of people ask is, well, you know what? Prophecy is talking about an outline of history, but why does it not mention other great nations such as China? We know that China had great dynasties, very powerful dynasties. What about the Aztecs here in South America? Why doesn't prophecy mention these empires, these kingdoms? It's very simple. As powerful and as influent as these nations were, they didn't have a lot of relevance when it comes to the children of God. What we find in history, what we find in prophecy, is that these nations that are mentioned in prophecy, they have direct impact on Judea, on the children of God. So that's why we find these mentioned. At this time, these 2 nations, they weren't even the most powerful in the planet. There were other arising powers on the horizon. Rome appears, and we don't get the beginning of Rome. When Rome appears in this story, it's already a power. So you see that what the Bible is mentioning here are empires or countries, kings, powers that impact directly the children of God in Judea. That's what we find here. So here we have a great outline of the battle of the kings of the north and the kings of the south. Again, this is fairly simple for you to research in history. Here we have basically 5 or 6 kings on each side that a lot happens among them. They battle, they fight. Judea is going from one to the other constantly. Not only do they battle, but there is a lot of political drama, all right? Political policies that happen. They try to have alliances through marriage, and that happens with Bernice, but then Bernice dies, and so much happens. And it might seem that this is a fairly long period of time. Reading it, we tend to assume that this happened over centuries. But when you look at history, really, this is a period that covers about 150 years. It's not even a long time. But this is basically what we find from verses 5 through 15. However, before we get to that, there is a short period of time there where Israel does war for independence. And again, we can find this when we research and we study about the Maccabean revolt. And so Israel, for a short while, they did have their own kings called the Maccabean kings of the Hasmonean house. And again, if you're interested in that, you can research and very easily you'll find a lot of information about that period of time. However, in verse 16, a new power arises. It tells us that he who comes, we find that in verse 16, he who comes, and this he who comes cannot be either the king of the north or the king of the south. In verse 15, at the end of this whole 150-year period of time, the king of the north, in the person of Antiochus Epiphanes, he emerges as victorious at the end of verse 15. And this was a terrible king. This was a terrible king of the north that dominated this land, the children of Israel. And one thing that I would like to mention before we enter the phase of Rome is that this Antiochus the fourth, or Antiochus Epiphanes, he is one of those kings that a lot of interpreters imagine that he fulfills a major role in chapter 11 of Daniel. But I really believe that is a major stretch. When you look at what he did and you look at the timeline that happens here, it seems that it is a major stretch to assume that Antiochus Epiphanes, he is the fulfillment of many verses or many timelines here in Daniel 11 for many reasons. First of all, the prophetic statement in verse 14 implies that these people, the people that were with Antiochus, his armies, his generals, that this appears in verse 12 and 13, they will be without success. Now, the fulfillment of what happens with Israel happens under people who did have success. Rome did have success of oppressing the children of Israel for a very long period of time. Antiochus Epiphanes, he didn't have that long. Secondly, verse 16 tells us that this power will stand in the beautiful land, and all of it will be in his hand. Now, this again has no conceivable application to Antiochus Epiphanes because Judea was already in his hand. He didn't have to conquer it. He didn't have to invade Judea. He didn't have to conquer it. It was given to him as land from his father. So it wouldn't make sense to say that this is the great king that came in, conquered, oppressed, persecuted the children of Israel, because while he did oppress and persecute them, the land was already his. He inherited it from his father. It makes a lot more sense to understand that the conquest of this power that appears in verse 16, it emerges with Rome in the person of Pompey when he conquers Judea in the year 63 BC. And finally, as we already discussed before, there is an immense amount of parallelism between chapter 7 and 8, the activities of the little horn of Daniel with what happens to the children of Israel in chapter 11. So the little horn in chapter 7 and 8 is never understood as Antiochus Epiphanes. It can't be, because it traverses time. Its activities happen over a span of thousands of years. It could never be interpreted as happening in the life of one king. So for all these reasons and more, Antiochus Epiphanes, at least in our study, he is not interpreted as this great king that had a huge impact on the children of Israel over a span of centuries. In any case, in verse 16, who emerges on the scene is Rome. And here we have, again, in the timeline of Rome, we have basically three Caesars that take the stage from verses 16 through 22. And you can do the comparison yourself. You can do the study yourself. We find in verse 17 through 19, Julius Caesar. And the actions that he did, the things that he did appear in verse 17, 18, and 19. We find Caesar Augustus in verse 20, the things that he did in verse 20. And then finally, Tiberius Caesar. And it is during the reign of Tiberius Caesar that the Prince of the Covenant would be broken. That's what we find here in verse 22. And that's a clear reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus is killed during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Jesus is also called the Anointed in chapter 9. In Matthew 27, Jesus is also called the Anointed One. All of this happened during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. This reference of Jesus as the Prince of the Covenant While I was doing my study, I'll tell you something. This gave me chills when I was studying the Prince of the Covenant. Because it is an extraordinary indicator that reveals the flow of history. The fact that God, years before, was giving us the information, or was giving Daniel the information of everything that would take place all the way up to the Messiah, that is God telling Daniel something. He's saying, Daniel, things might appear to be chaotic. Things may appear to be happening too fast or too slow or not in the right time. But Daniel, I need you to understand that I am in control, that I have power over history, that I know what is going to happen, and I have provisions for things that are going to happen. So as I was studying this, and I found the emergence here of the Prince of the Covenant that was then broken, that was just something that gave me chills. At this point, in verse 23, we arrive at the second portion of this chapter, the second great arc, or division, if you will. Verse 23 is a transition point in the prophecy of chapter 11. Verses 1 through 22, they guide the action from Daniel's day all the way down to the Messiah, to the Prince of the Covenant. And that means that everything that happens, the four kings of the Medo-Persians, the great king of Greece, the four prominent ones that come out of that kingdom, all these wars with the kings of the north and the south, everything that happens in the first half of that chapter. Do you understand this? There's just so many details. Now, what's incredible to me is that God, he successively gives deeper visions about the same period of time. So in Daniel chapter 2, you have a great outline of history. In Daniel chapter 7, God kind of zones in a little bit on the four kingdoms. Then in chapter 8, he zones in on two kingdoms and what happens after the second kingdom with the little horn. But in chapter 11, God goes in. It's like he puts history under a microscope, and God gives just so many details that we have packed here in this first half of chapter 11. But then the focus shifts to something different. From verse 23 through 39, Daniel deals with another power. A power that we interpret and we understand for many reasons that we're going to see here as ecclesiastical Rome. You know that Rome came in verse 16. We have 3 Caesars, but then we find here at the height of the power of the North King, Rome comes in with Pompey, and they take dominion over Judea. And at that point, we have the prince being broken. And one of the questions that is most asked at this point is, well, where do we go from here? Where do we go? Do we interpret the prophecy to be linear? Is it, are the events that are described from verse 23 through 39, do they happen immediately after verse 22? Or is there a gap in the history of prophecy? So couldn't verse 23 continue with imperial Rome for a further stretch? Why don't we interpret it that way? Why do we interpret it as being ecclesiastical, papal Rome right after? In verse 23. Now, some believe that it is the case that, imperial Rome is just described from verse 23 through 29, that we have a repeat of the 3 Caesars, Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, and then Tiberius. Some interpret it that way, but it doesn't make much sense. It's not very consecutive if we interpret it that way. The information that happens too quickly for it to be seen as a Hebrew parallelism. Other people believe that the text beginning in verse 23, it kind of skips down to the time of the Roman conquest in the year 70. Some interpret it that way, that 23 through 29, they're really covering the period of the conquest of Rome in the year 70. And others yet believe that the time of Constantine would make sense due to the major historical transition with the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. But again, Constantine, he doesn't fit these few verses very well. So that way, verse 23 and 22 and 23, they jump over centuries of time, which isn't the immediate concern here anyway. The prophecy, it's not interested in covering every single minor event in history. It's trying to tell us something, that God is in control of history. So when we understand it that way here, from 22 to 23, you jump a few centuries in time. The segment now is the emergence of the second phase of Rome, which goes from imperial Rome all the way to ecclesiastical Rome, papal Rome. And most interpreters, they understand that transition happened around the 6th century. And so here we find ecclesiastical Rome already in the Middle Ages. It's not imperial Rome anymore, it's religious, spiritual, ecclesiastical, or papal Rome. So just to be clear, Daniel 11:23 deals with the activities of Rome in its second phase, not in its imperial time anymore, but in its spiritual condition. The players change here. We find that the king of the north, in name, he doesn't appear until verse 40 again. And the king of the south, it seems as though he takes a step back. The players change, but the game is the same. A question that does arise here is, well, how did this happen? How did this switch from imperial to ecclesiastical Rome happen? And the answer is, well, Constantine, he switches the capital of Rome. You guys remember how this happens in the 4th century. He switches the capital of Rome to where? Constantinople, which was ancient Byzantine. And he switches the capital there. And what happens to Rome? Rome, who is leading? Who has power in the city of Rome? The Bishop of Rome. He has the power. So this transition from imperial Rome to ecclesiastical Rome, it starts happening over there. And from verse 23 through 39, we find many events that characterize the activities of the northern king now in the person of ecclesiastical or papal Rome. We find from verse 23 through 30, we have the military campaigns, all the wars that they fought. There were 9 crusades that were fought, especially from the 11th century through the 13th century. There might seem to be a gap. So you're saying, all right, so we jump from the Messiah who was broken in verse 22. You jump to the 6th century, which is the transition from imperial Rome to ecclesiastical Rome. And then we jump again to the Crusades to, 5 centuries later. Yeah, there's no problem with that. We find that in prophecy many times. I'll give you an example of this. You remember how Xerxes transitions from Xerxes to Alexander the Great. We saw that in verse 2. We find this transition from Xerxes in Middle Persia to Alexander the Great in Greece. That was a century of a transition. Prophecy jumped 100 years, and it wasn't even preoccupied or worried in explaining what happened in the meantime. This is something that happens commonly in prophecy, especially in Daniel 11, because the necessity isn't to explain each minor detail, but every big figure, every relevant figure that has to do with the people of God. So again, this is what happens here. So the first activities of this northern king, or the little horn of Daniel chapter 8, the activities begin with military campaigns. We find that in verses 23 through 30. Then we find in verse 31 the subversion of the system of salvation. Do you remember how this little horn, or this another northern kingdom, how they subvert the system of salvation? When the Bible says that the temple was brought down low, this is in Daniel chapter 8, that the temple was brought down low. When the Bible gives us this piece of information, we find that the heaven being brought down low, it doesn't mean that, this power, it brought heaven down. It doesn't mean that the heavenly temple up in heaven was brought down low. What it truly means is that this power, it placed itself in the position of God. It profaned, it desecrated the temple. These are the literal words that are used in Daniel chapter 8. It was profaned, it was desecrated. So this power, it desecrates the temple up in heaven. How? Well, it places itself in the person or in the place of the high priest of heaven, saying that it can forgive sin, saying that, and we all know the big boasts of papal Rome in the medieval times, where it said that it was God, that it sat on the throne of God, and that in ex cathedra, when it was sitting down on his throne, he had the voice of God. And that is the way that we find the papal power bringing down the temple in heaven. The third activity that we find this power developing is from verse 32 through 35, and it's persecution. And here again, we have many examples of this. This is the only time in chapter 11 that we find a persecution. It's the only time. But it is mentioned in chapter 8. It's mentioned when Jesus talks about the end of days in Matthew chapter 24. We find this persecution happening. And here we have many references to this. We have the Inquisition. We have the Holy Inquisition happening following the subsequent centuries after the Crusades. We find historically that this rivalry against the papal the papal power and the children of God, it leads to many deaths, bloodshed in the children of God. So this is a further activity. It's persecution. The first one that we find, again, is the military campaigns described in those 7 verses. Then we have the subversion of the system of salvation. We have persecution happening in those 3 verses. And finally, we have self-exaltation. Daniel 11:36 says, he shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. He shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods. And here we find 2 charges, self-exaltation and blasphemy. Self-exaltation and blasphemy. These 2 charges correspond perfectly to the characteristics of the little horn as revealed in both Daniel 7:25. He speaks great words against the Most High. And then Daniel chapter 8, 10, and 11, where we read, he grew until it reached the host of heavens and set itself up to be as great as the Prince of Hosts. Now, historically, this rivalry against the God of heaven was manifested by titles, which this earthly power assumed and claimed for itself. So these were the activities of this little horn in 7, 8, and 11. Interestingly enough, the activities of the little horn in chapter 11, the last 3 of them, they appear also in chapter 8 and chapter 7. The last 2 in chapter 7, the last 3 in chapter 8. And these are the events all the way up to when this power, the horn or the king of the north, it is broken. And finally we arrive at Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, where we have a mention of the time of the end. Now, first, we have to understand that there's a difference between the time of the end and the end of times. In prophecy, there's a big difference between the time of the end and the end of times. The time of the end is a period of time. It's a segment of history in which certain events will happen. Those are the events that we find in these last 5 chapters, 5 verses of chapter 11. Now, the end of time is a point in time. It's a moment in time. It is the end of human history as we know it. So this section is perhaps the most difficult passage to interpret prophetically because it's in the future. It hasn't happened yet. There are many of these events that have not happened yet. At this point, we are way beyond the times of the Seleucid kings or the Ptolemaic dynasties. We're way beyond that time. Now we're dealing with new powers that have taken their place. And the question is, who are these powers? Many interpretations have been given. Many have been given. Many have been suggested. But there is no final answer on this question that has been ultimately given. It's been hotly debated among Adventist theologians, Adventist pioneers in more modern times. Maybe the best thing that we can say is that since these events are still in the future, we're going to have to wait until they happen, until we see them, so that we can truly understand what happens. Do you remember what is the ultimate goal of prophecy? What does Jesus say in John chapter 14, verse 29? That's where he gives us the ultimate goal, the ultimate purpose of prophecy in the Bible. He says, and now I have told you before it comes to pass, that when it does come to pass, you may believe. That's the purpose of prophecy. You see that we can get very confused in all these details that happen, but the purpose of prophecy is that when it happens, we may believe, that our faith may be increased. That's the purpose of prophecy. This is what we find at the end of chapter 11. My dear friends, God is always in control. He always wins. And his children, as his children, we share that victory. As we study this chapter 11, and we see that throughout history, God has always been taking care of his people. You know what that reassures me? That he can still do it for me. Just as he guided the children of Israel through those turmoils of the king of the north and the king of the south, as he guided his children through the Caesars and through medieval history and up to our days, I understand that, you know what, God isn't the God that is only interested in history, world history. He's interested in my history. He's interested in my yesterdays, in my battles, in my losses, in my confusions and doubts, in my failures. He is interested in taking me, a broken vessel, transforming me, and helping me become his child that will in the end be victorious over the dragon. You know, Revelation says that through the blood of the Lamb, they were able to be victorious. They were able to win. So may God bless you as you study prophecy. It's not always easy. These are very difficult chapters, but the Lord, he didn't reveal it for nothing. He revealed it for a purpose, which is for us to understand and our faith be believed. be increased. May God bless you. That was the lesson for today. I hope that you can join us again next Sabbath for another Sabbath school study hour. May God bless you.